Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm your host, Hannah Tyler. In this week's episode, we have a newsy episode focused on the latest in immigration. We'll highlight some of the major happenings in the immigration world, including the end of MPP, high-skilled immigration and the CHIPS Act, the collapse of the legal immigration system, and child separation. BPC regular Theresa Brown and I will unpack all of that after the break. Stick around for a great episode. And we're back. I'm here with BPC's Managing Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy, back from vacation just in time to help us break down all of the major immigration happenings over the summer. Welcome back, Theresa.
Glad to be here.
Glad to have you. First up, let's talk about Remain in Mexico. After the Supreme Court ruled on June 30th that President Biden could end the migrant protection protocols, the administration announced on August 8th that several thousand migrants forced to wait in Mexico would gradually be allowed to enter the United States to pursue their asylum claims, and said that migrants would no longer be enrolled in the program, marking the effective end of MPP. Theresa, can you walk us through the significance of the end of this program?
Well, this is something that President Biden campaigned on in 2020. It is something that many immigration advocates have worked toward for a very long time. So just to go back in time, the Migrant Protection Protocols, or Remain in Mexico, was a program put in place by the Trump administration in 2019 to try to address the arrivals of asylum seekers at the border. And under this policy, which was not agreed to by Mexico per se, but acquiesced to by Mexico, asylum seekers, particularly families, could be made to wait in Mexico while their asylum cases proceeded in U.S. immigration courts. Now, this program was subject to a lot of criticism by a lot of immigration and human rights advocates, including UN High Commissioner on Refugees, because of the high rates of kidnapping, extortion, violence against migrants that were waiting in Mexico under these conditions. At the height of the program, tens of thousands of migrants had been enrolled. After President Biden came into office, he ended the program and started allowing those migrants to come into the United States to wait their asylum claims and immigration court cases in the United States. The states of Texas and Missouri sued. And in a what I would call a somewhat extreme legal argument, and I only say that because the Supreme Court agreed, the states argued that immigration law actually required Remain in Mexico. Now, this is extreme in part because the statute that they based this interpretation on had been part of the immigration laws since the mid-1990s, and no previous administration of either party had interpreted it to require that either migrants arriving be put into detention in the United States or sent back to Mexico. And the Supreme Court agreed in a 5-4 decision where two conservative justices, Justice Roberts and Justice Kavanaugh, agreed with the liberal justices that that interpretation with the statute was just completely wrong. Additionally, they also said that the Biden administration had, via a second termination memo, adequately met the requirements of the Administrative Procedures Act. So after this Supreme Court decision, they ruled basically the Biden administration could end the program. They had not violated any law in doing so. They sent the case back to the Fifth Circuit, and Judge Kaczmarek in Texas, who had made the original ruling, who rescinded his original ruling, and the administration said that they would again ramp down the program. Now, this time at the renewal of the program, the Biden administration had not enrolled nearly as many people as the Trump administration had, primarily because Title 42 was also in place at the same time, and the vast majority of people who were returned to Mexico were returned under Title 42.
So you sort of touched on this question, but will the end of MPP have any effect on numbers at the border?
I don't know. I mean, at this point in time, it's really hard to say whether any particular program is having any particular effect. I mean, we only kind of know in retrospect looking at when different policies are put in place and what happens subsequently, whether or not they've been effective. So, for example, even when MPP was in place, it's unclear how much of an impact it had. Numbers were still rising through a lot of 2019. It really wasn't until the beginning of COVID in 2020 and the introduction of Title 42 that numbers at the border started declining. But then, later in 2020, they started picking up again and have been increasing pretty much steadily, or at least staying high throughout most of the Biden administration, whether or not MPP was in place. Under the Biden administration, the nationalities of who was sent back to Mexico also changed. During the Trump administration, anybody of any nationality could be sent back to Mexico for the migrant protection protocols. Under the Biden administration, it was primarily used for nationals of countries that we couldn't expel people to under Title 42. So that would be like Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, but Mexico wouldn't take them back. So it's Central Americans, smaller numbers. I think it's hard to say whether it will have any long-term impact at this point in time because it was so small at this point. I think right now we're still in a place where Title 42 is still covers the majority, although a slim majority now, of cases at the border. And frankly, a lot more people are just being admitted and processed into the case backlog in immigration courts.
Do you think that the end of MPP will increase pressure on the administration to end Title 42?
Well, the administration is under a lot of pressure to do so, and they attempted to do so. But as we also have spoken on this program, the courts intervened in that case as well and said that they have to continue Title 42 for now. In addition, Congress has kind of weighed in on this, and in two different appropriations bills that are making their way through Congress right now, amendments have been added to require the administration to keep Title 42 in place. So I'd say the administration is facing pressure from both sides. Advocates want Title 42 taken down. Immigration border hawks and Republicans and even some Democrats along the border say, hey, not so fast. Title 42 right now is the only remaining policy that allows us to manage this in any way. I think that it's going to continue to be a back and forth.
And last question on this section. Do you think there's a chance that another program like this is going to be attempted in the future?
Well, I think obviously there's a lot of Republicans who believe that MPP was an effective program. And again, legislation has been introduced by some Republicans in Congress that would mandate MPP, to change the underlying law to require it, whereas the Supreme Court said the current law does not. It's hard to say. I mean, a new president could come in and make the same claims. Again, the Supreme Court only ruled that it wasn't required to do it. It didn't say it was illegal to do it. And there's procedural things that have to be done to put it in place or not. But the program was controversial and remains controversial. So I think, whoever occupies the White House of whatever party, absent, I think, a broader fundamental rethinking, and we've talked about this before, of how we manage migration at the border, any particular program is going to have, if any, temporary effect, and minimal effect. And the last thing about MPP, I think that makes it a bit more of a challenge than other things we might do, is that it definitely requires Mexico to cooperate. And Mexico gets to decide who it lets back in, what nationalities, what types of migrants, whether it's just adults or families or children. And that can limit the effectiveness of any future administration in trying to implement a program like this.
Okay, well, let's move on to the arena of high-skilled immigration. President Biden signed the CHIPS Act into law on August 9th. The $280 billion bill aims to boost domestic high-tech manufacturing and increase American competitiveness over China, particularly with investments into the American semiconductor industry. Despite calls to include provisions establishing a new visa category for entrepreneurs and a direct path to permanent residence for immigrants who earn a STEM PhD in the U.S., the immigration provisions ultimately fell out of the final bill. So, Theresa, what does the exclusion of these immigration provisions originally included in Competes mean for the implementation and ultimate success of the CHIPS Act?
So I think, as our colleagues who work on our tech and AI projects have said, the United States at the moment is not graduating sufficient Americans in many of these fields to really quickly ramp up the research and development, manufacturing, engineering that's needed to really restart semiconductor processing and manufacturing in the United States at the levels that the CHIPS Act is hoping to do. And, I think that the idea of, quote unquote, stapling a green card to PhD graduates of STEM programs in the United States has been part of the immigration discussion for more than a decade. Provisions like this were included in the 2013 Senate bipartisan immigration bill. Different types of legislation have been introduced. So I think it's not surprising that there's a lot of, I think, support and bipartisan support for at least recognizing the value that these high skilled immigrants could bring to the United States. And in particular, now that we are really looking strategically at these industries as being important for our national interest and our national security in some cases, I think that adds impetus to this. And, you just look at who is graduating, particularly from PhD programs. A very high percentage of the graduates are foreign nationals that have been on F1 or student visas for many of the years here. So making them go through a lottery essentially to get an H-1B. And it's worth noting that the process to go from student to green card now does require them to mostly go through the H-1B, which is cap limited and therefore subject every year to a lottery by USCIS to see who gets a green card, who gets an H-1B visa. That lottery does not preference any particular company or industry. So even if we, as a nation, believe that semiconductor research, development, manufacturing, certain technologies are in our national interest, our current immigration system does not prioritize those in terms of getting people in the system. So, that's something Congress could consider, but this is the way that they're looking at it, at least just get them to be able to get a green card fairly quickly.
So along those lines, we've been seeing calls to include immigration in the high-tech manufacturing conversation grow louder in the last few weeks, with 9 major chip companies releasing an open letter pushing for green card reform to let more of these high-skilled workers stay. Why do you think that these calls have grown so loud in the last few weeks, and do you think that this momentum will last?
There was a lot of talk about including them in the conference report when the House and Senate bills were trying to be conferenced. What ended up happening was a brand new deal was cut in the Senate for a much smaller bill. And that's what the House ended up passing after the Senate passed it. But I think there are separate bills that have been introduced that do have bipartisan support. Similar provisions have been added to other bills, both in the past and this year. So I think that it's just sort of a confluence of timing and opportunity that these issues are coming to the fore. And again, this recognition that the United States may have let some competitive advantage go over the last decades by not supporting some of those people who could really make the United States match up to where China is. There was just a report out today saying that foreign students from China, for example, in the U.S. post-secondary system have declined precipitously. Now, I know that there are some who are concerned about Chinese students in these areas from a national security standpoint and whether or not they may be there to essentially help the Chinese government advance. But many of them do end up staying. And, if you can go back in history, I mean, the United States has benefited enormously from foreign scientists who have come to the United States from other countries to help us do better. Going back to Albert Einstein and, development of jets and fuel and the nuclear bomb, for better or for worse. Post-Soviet Russia, we actively sought to have Russian scientists come to the United States so that we could have a competitive advantage over Russia during the Cold War. So if we believe this is in our national interest, I think we need to think about it not just as an immigration issue, but as a national security and competitiveness issue.
Do you think thinking about it from a lens of national security and competitiveness has a chance of shifting the conversation a little bit?
I think it already has. You're definitely seeing, I think, more bipartisan support for this group of people specifically. You're seeing more bipartisan national security leaders in the defense and technology space talk about it. And they are talking about it in this lens of competitiveness. I think, more and more Americans are kind of recognizing that however we want to talk about it, we are facing a renewed Cold War or some kind of competitiveness with China, that is a new rising national security threat. The influence of China around the world, in particular in places like in the Western Hemisphere, their Belt and Road Initiative, the investments that they're making around the world, but in technology. And the advancements that they are making in technology is something to concern us. The other thing that we've really recognized since COVID is that our dependency on China for many of the key components of things we use every day, everything from automobiles to, military grade weapons, are reliant on foreign supply chains. That is a vulnerability for us. So I think we've just kind of been made aware in the last few years of the importance of looking at this in a different way.
So you mentioned earlier that there's some pieces of legislation, bipartisan legislation, floating around in this arena. What kind of vehicles might lawmakers use to move these provisions forward? What kind of legislation exists that they might push?
Well, the one that's out there right now is the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, which is the bill that is passed every year to authorize essentially our entire defense apparatus and funding. That is a must-pass bill for Congress every year. It usually ends up being bipartisan, although there are different partisan spats throughout. But the bill that is proceeding right now has an amendment that would not as broad as what was in the Competes Act, at least would allow an expedited process for green cards for foreign graduates in STEM fields, in particular national security areas. So it's a little bit narrower, but it's the same concept. And again, that had bipartisan support. So since that is a must-pass piece of legislation, it tends to be something that everybody tries to attach their favorite thing to. But in this case, it's actually directly relevant to the national defense. There's also the annual appropriations bills, which could be a vehicle for something similar as well. So we just have to see what potentials there are this year. But I think regardless of what happens this year, even if Congress changes hands, at least in the House, there's talk that Republicans might take over. Given the bipartisan nature of this, I think it's possible that it will continue to be a live issue in the next Congress.
Sort of a more broad question. How has the conversation surrounding high-skilled immigration changed and shifted in the last few years?
So I think, for much of the last decade, the conversation around high-skilled immigration has focused exclusively on the H-1B program and the pros and cons of that program, the monopolization of that program by many information technology services companies, including those from India. It's sort of gotten caught up in a lot of outsourcing and offshoring and competitiveness, the U.S. workforce being competitive. I think the shift that I'm seeing, a couple of different things. One is this understanding that, at least for a certain cadre of folks in the STEM arena, our current immigration system is not helping our own competitiveness. But I think, secondly, the growing just dysfunction of the high-skilled immigration system, the growing backlogs, the fact that people who are trying to get green cards are waiting so long that their kids are aging out, the so-called documented dreamers issue, which we'll probably talk about also. These lines are growing to the point where they're ridiculous, that it is not functioning in any way that is helpful to employers, to immigrants, to U.S. workers. It's just not working. And so I think the brokenness of the system, the increasing brokenness of the legal immigration system, and the high-skilled legal immigration system, that even though people may think that the H-1B program is not working well, most people still recognize that high-skilled immigrants can be really good for the United States. And yet the system is not working that way. And as I mentioned, it's just not meeting our interests, whether we're talking national interests or security interests or competitive issues or just our economy. So I think that is rising again to the fore. The economic loss that we face by not having an immigration system that supports these kinds of things, I think is worth noting. And I think it's probably generating more conversations than I've seen in several years about how we can remedy this.
Well, that's a perfect segue into our next section. As we've seen, the immigration system is beginning to buckle under its own weight. You said, and we've observed, immigration processes have drastically slowed in the last few years and have led to the exponential growth of backlogs and wait times for case processing, court decisions. A recent article in Borderlines highlighted a number of issues contributing to this massive system failure: policy choices, the outdated nature of our legal immigration framework, and simple technical issues like a larger volume of applications and proceedings. We've been highlighting the inefficiencies and issues in our legal immigration system for a long time, and we just released a report focused on potential areas of consensus for system fixes to the legal immigration system. So, Theresa, can you dive a little more deeply into the factors contributing to this sort of large-scale collapse of our legal immigration system?
Well, I think you highlighted several of them, but like a lot of things in our society, COVID sort of exacerbated problems that were pre-existing and just ratchet them up to 1,000, right? So let's start with different policy choices. So one thing we do know is that under the Trump administration, there were active policies generated from the Trump White House to restrict and slow down legal immigration case processing. We documented through a couple of blogs the increases in requests for evidence on what had been standard cases in the past that slowed down processing times, that sometimes resulted in increased denials, that, requirements for extra vetting and interviews that had previously been waived. And any one of these by themselves probably may have been marginally impactful to the backlogs, but taken together, they did slow things down a lot and decrease the number of particularly green cards issued during the Trump administration. But I think that the single most proximate factor is COVID. So when everything shut down, including the government, due to COVID, and everybody was forced to work remotely, government processing in the immigration space was subject to that as well. The problem is that our legal immigration system, and frankly, our immigration court system, which deals with removals, is still primarily very heavily paper-based. It is based on receiving paper applications, reviewing paper applications, pushing paper files between offices and parts of the system. And when everybody worked remotely, that meant that they could not push the papers around. Government employees are not generally allowed to take their work home with them that way because those papers are deemed confidential or restricted in some way, even if not classified. But their ability to access certain types of systems remotely is also limited. And so the fact that our immigration system is still kind of caught in the 80s and reliant on paper just really ground it very much to the bare minimum during COVID. And there was a GAO report that documented this, an OIG report that documented it, and it just slowed case processing both through USCIS and the legal immigration system and immigration courts, and visa offices overseas shut down so that people who had approvals couldn't get visas to come to the United States. And many cases, particularly with green cards, if you have a green card available and you don't get it within a year, that green card could go away. We saw that with the diversity visa lottery, which are time limited. So, the lack of processing there caused huge backlogs and delays. So, all of that taken together, and then, as you mentioned, the growing number of cases filed. So COVID did depress the incoming number of cases for a while, but overall, the system has been growing backlogs, more and more people applying, in part to keep whatever benefits they can going. So whether that's an asylum seeker whose case is now taking 3 to 5 years, continuing to ask for more work authorization once they're eligible, to somebody who's on an H-1B visa waiting a green card that might not come for another decade, they still have to file extensions every once in a while to make sure that they can maintain status in the interim. So all of these interim filings add to the case log, and the longer a case sits, the more of these interim filings have to happen. And so, for example, the employment authorization document, which is issued to everyone from foreign students who are eligible to work, to asylum seekers, to people waiting in the green card line, to TPS holders, just has ballooned to the extent that USCIS had to issue a temporary rule allowing people with current employment authorization to continue to work even after their document had expired for 540 days. Like, that's incredible. So we're doing these workarounds. So all of these things contribute to the backlogs, and basically the system as it was designed to work, the really detailed, bureaucracy of it is just grinding to a halt. Then you add to that, what we might call crises or sudden shocks to the system, like the sudden resettlement of tens of thousands of Afghans to the United States and processing of humanitarian parole and asylum applications for them. And then for Ukraine as well, there weren't extra people sitting around doing nothing when any of those things happen. So they were taken off of one set of filings and put on another. And so we keep reshuffling the order of things we're processing, but not really making any headway on the overall mound of cases out there. And that's where we're at right now.
So realistically, what kind of resources are needed to begin really tackling this mound?
Resources is the key issue. And when I say resources, I mean hiring a lot more people into the system, really seriously investing in digitizing as much of this as possible. Like the fact that we are still relying on paper systems is just so inefficient in the modern era. We need to be able to move everything as much as possible into a digital format, electronic filing, electronic processing, electronic approvals, electronic notifications. Like if IRS can do this, we should be able to do it too, and the immigration system, and it needs investment. Part of the challenge, though, is that at least USCIS and to a certain extent the visa offices at State Department have been designed to be fee funded. So they don't regularly get congressional appropriations to allow them to address growing backlogs. The only way they can do so is by increasing fees on new filings. But that doesn't help. They've already received fees for the filings they're already processing at a lower rate that were below the cost to process them. So they're always in arrears and trying to figure out how much they can charge to process the cases that they already have. So there's no built-in backlog reduction funding, right? There's none there. And certain types of cases, the US government has decided we don't want to charge fees for, and those are primarily refugee and asylum processing. So other types of cases are charged more to compensate. So when we've seen an increase in asylum filings like we have, there's no additional fees coming in for that. And again, since you're in arrears and raising fees for the rest of the types of cases, you have a huge mismatch. So, USCIS has been seeking extra funding from Congress for the last couple of fiscal years since in the Trump administration. Probably we need to rethink that idea that our immigration system can be completely fee funded in this way. It's just not doable. So we need a lot more, Congress needs to appropriate money, a lot more money to hire a lot more adjudicators to really tackle this backlog. And USCIS needs to be forward thinking. It needs to have a better way to try to say, look, we can't really adequately predict what our incoming case filings are going to look like. We don't know how many people are going to show up the border asking for asylum. We don't know how many people are going to seek green cards in any given year or H-1Bs or anything else like that. So since we don't know how many cases we're going to come in, we need to build in to our planning and our budgetary process a fund that we can draw on when we have backlogs growing and that we can replenish when we have, cleared things out. That kind of extra funding, but basically a reserve, is really necessary to kind of keep this from happening. Immigration courts also completely overwhelmed. They do receive a lot of appropriated funding, but we are probably a decade behind in trying to hire more immigration courts, judges and others to try to clear out this backlog. And again, it's at the very fundamental, it's an input-output problem. More stuff coming in, fewer stuff going out the other side, the backlogs grow, the funding isn't keeping up. And so we just need to, in the short run, throw a lot more resources at it, really just accelerate the transition to electronic and more efficient case processing. And then I think last but not least, let's look at whatever we can in sort of the policy realm to maintain the integrity of the system, but figure out how we can more efficiently process cases without them lasting forever. How many redundant checks do we really need? Some things are self-perpetuating. I mentioned sort of as cases pen longer, the fingerprints that are filed expire and they have to get new fingerprints, right? So that further delays the cases, like things like that. Like backlogs beget more work in and of themselves. And so finding ways to streamline all of this is going to be necessary.
And you touched a little bit on this in terms of like self-perpetuating backlogs, but if the system continues to function the way it's functioning currently, what kind of large-scale repercussions might we see?
Well, I think we're seeing it right now. So one of the immediate repercussions is that Congress, through statute, has said how many green cards of different categories, family and employment-based, can be issued each year. For each of the last at least 4 fiscal years, since 2020, going on to current fiscal year, the system has not been able to issue all of the available green cards. So what that means, according to the statute, is that some portion of green cards simply disappear. They go away, never to be seen again. They can't be recaptured in the next year. Diversity visa is the most obvious example because those are only valid for that current fiscal year. There's a weird, complicated spill down procedure that happens. So unused family-based visas can spill down to the employment-based category. So in the subsequent year, there might be extra employment-based visas. But if they can't issue all of them, they don't really spill back up. They just kind of go away. And so we're talking now probably in hundreds of thousands of visas over the last several years that have just disappeared. And that means we're not even using our current system to the capacity it has. And of course, as we've just spoken about, many people believe our current legal immigration system is below the capacity we need it to be at. So we are losing out on people that can come to the United States and help us in whatever way they are able to help us, whether it's economically or reunifying families or all of those things. The longer this goes on, the fewer people are choosing to come to the United States, right? So fewer international students lead into that high-skilled visa pipeline, and I think that causes us to suffer in the long run. As we have started talking about with our economic policy project, long-term demographics for the United States absent immigration don't look good. We have an aging and shrinking workforce. The workforce growth is its smallest it's ever been. And immigration is one of those ways we have kept ahead of other countries facing even more severe population issues like Japan or Russia or even China. So, we need to kind of take a look at this and recognize that not having a functioning immigration system, even as badly mismatched as our immigration system is to where we want to be, having it not function even the way it is currently designed is hurting us. And I think that's a growing concern that people are starting to recognize.
Okay, well, thank you for so eloquently outlining the problems that the legal immigration system is facing. Let's now take a look back at one of the biggest policy issues in immigration from the Trump administration that's back in the news because of a new extensive piece in The Atlantic by Caitlin Dickerson, The Secret History of Family Separation, which charts the course that zero tolerance, a policy which separated children from their parents at the border, took to implementation under the Trump administration in 2018. In the article, Dickerson argues that part of the reason that the policy was implemented is because very few people fully understand immigration policy in DC, and so most people didn't understand the full implications of the policy that was being suggested until it was already happening. What effect does this general lack of understanding of immigration policy have in DC and beyond?
Wow, that is a really big question. It's probably the reason I've been involved in this area for 30 plus years. I mean, I think as we talked about, over the 100 and some episodes of the show, immigration is really a complicated policy issue. And it impacts so many other areas of our country, of our national security, of our economy, of how we see ourselves. But at its bottom, it implicates people. And I think, the big sort of takeaway that, from the article, and I think a lot of people realized this, as it was going on in 2018 and 2019, was that at its core, this policy was not something that most people in the United States believed was humane. And when I say most people, there was bipartisan approbation for this policy, such that it forced President Trump to formally rescind it. It is one of the few border policies that the Trump administration rescinded rather than doubling down on to try to manage the border. And I think that, in an effort to try to address what was a rapidly sort of spiraling crisis at the border of arriving families, the response that the administration wanted to try, or at least the proponents of this policy wanted to try, was basically to try to deter families by promising them an absolutely horrific result if they came to the United States with their kids. Now, several of the people quoted in the article said, they thought that by promising people and telling people they would take their kids away from them, it would deter them from bringing their kids and therefore save those children from the harms of the migration journey. But I think they failed to recognize the extent to which they were themselves causing more harm. And that's the real, I think, tragedy of this, is that, people who were looking at it from an operational perspective, or maybe what they thought was an objective policy lens, were making an assumption about how to influence these parental choices that turned out, one, not to be correct, because the policy did not actually significantly reduce overall immigration. It caused families to send their kids separately anyway, but it also just traumatized, thousands of families in ways that the United States had never really done before. Now, I remember very explicitly during this time, because I was asked a lot about it in the press, well, didn't this happen under the Obama administration? And the answer I had to give was yes, but in very limited circumstances. So under the law, as it still exists, if someone is not the parent or legal guardian of a minor child when they arrive at the border, to ensure that that child is not being trafficked, the parent and the adult and the child may be separated, and the child treated as an unaccompanied child. That's actually required for the most part under the law, though the Biden administration is trying to make policies that can kind of work around that. But the policy that Trump put in place of full prosecutions, which would result in separation of a larger number of parents and children, and especially children of very, very young age. I think there were a small number of people who kind of thought that might happen and thought that would be a deterrent. And a lot of other people who didn't really understand that operationally the system was not designed to do that separation and then reunite families later. There were assumptions made about, there's got to be a system in place, except there wasn't, because it wasn't a large scale phenomenon. And so as it played out, and continued separations just grew the problem bigger. And as the problem was really understood, and now years later, we are still trying to figure out how to reunite some of these parents and children. I think it's really good that Ms. Dickerson wrote the article. I think there will be lots of governmental reports and GAO reports and OIG reports and congressional reports probably looking into this in the future. But it's really a study in understanding how people who believe they are doing a well-meaning thing can end up doing a very wrong thing. And I think that, yes, there were some people in the administration who knew what they were doing, and the cruelty was the point, as some have written. And I think for a lot of others, they truly believed that they would somehow be saving these children by deterring other parents from doing it. It would be a small number that we'd have to do this to deter a lot larger number, except it never worked out that way. And once it was put in place, it just ballooned.
Sort of to that point, can you talk a little bit about the efficacy of deterrence-based methods of managing migration?
I think what the lesson of child separation and frankly of migrant protection protocols and Title 42 and everything that we have been trying to manage this new style, type, and demographic of migration that has been happening at our US-Mexico border since the mid-2010s is that deterrence alone as a policy does not have a long-term impact, particularly when you have mitigating factors against deterrence. So one of those mitigating factors is frankly just the desperation of the migrants coming. If we are in a race to the bottom, if you will, against the situations that these migrants are fleeing, we're going to lose. We're going to lose. And I think child separation is a particular evidence that there is a point at which Americans are not going to condone, certain actions in the name of deterrence like that. So I think that we're never going to be crueler to them than the places they are coming from. And so if that's our answer is we just make it worse on them than where they left to deter them from coming, I think we're always going to be on the losing side of that. The second is that we have to understand that now the criminal smuggling organizations that are facilitating most of the migration right now have a money-making capitalistic incentive to find ways through or around or over any deterrence policy we put in place at the border. As a matter of fact, they will use those policies to encourage more migration. And whether that is just trying to, if you will, send hundreds of migrants at a time to quote unquote flood the zone so that, more of them can get through, or if people aren't able to turn themselves in, helping facilitate them to evade detection. So as more people were being turned away under Title 42, we incentivize the smugglers and the migrants to go back to more dangerous routes of evading Border Patrol detection. And that results in 50 people dying in the back of a tractor trailer in San Antonio, all of whom went into that truck willingly because they thought it was going to get them where they wanted to go in the United States. So we are up against, significant, sophisticated networks that are continuing to try to market and facilitate this migration. And so I think continuing to rely on deterrence as the primary means of managing the border is going to have and is already having diminishing returns. And I think the lack of understanding of immigration policy leads to widespread belief that we can somehow just literally prevent people from crossing the line at the border. That's not how the border works in any way. And even building a wall would not do that because we can't build the wall on Mexico's side of the border. We can't even build the wall in many cases right on the border because the border is in the middle of a river. So you're technically already on US soil when you get to the wall. And at that point, US law is implicated and we have to take you into custody if we can. So again, if people are turning themselves in, that's not going to stop them. Will it slow down people who are trying to evade detection? Sure. But is it in the long run, a wall going to deter anybody? No, we've already seen that. People climbing up and falling down 30 feet and breaking their legs because they're desperate to get to the United States. People digging under or cutting through or going around, right? They will keep trying to come. So I do think that we are seeing sort of what the limits of deterrence alone can do in managing migration at the border. I think the evidence is in front of us right now.
You touched on this earlier, but zero tolerance led to a lot of long-term fallout, and there are still separated children who haven't been reunited with their families. So how is the Biden administration working to reunite these children with their families, and what other fallout is the administration dealing with?
So the Biden administration, when they came in, formed a family reunification task force, brought in somebody at the head of that to work directly with NGO organizations and the U.S. government agencies to try to identify children in the system who were separated, to try to locate their parents. Many of the parents have been deported back to their home countries. Some of them are in the United States, but we don't know where, or maybe, we've not been able to reunite them. A lot of this boils down to the fact that at the time that they were separated, very, very few records were kept. A lot of these were very, very young children who were not able themselves to communicate anything about their parents. So, we're relying on incomplete, if any, or non-existent governmental records to try to identify children and who they might be related to and where those parents are. So I think, as with any sort of exercise of this magnitude, the last ones to be reunited are probably going to be the hardest cases. We may find out that some of the parents have died. We may find out that, the children are just not going to be able to be reunited for whatever reason. And I think these will be very tragic cases. So I do think that, I think at last report, there's a few hundred that they're still trying to reunite. I think one good thing that has come out of this is that the systems that the government agencies are using now, when there is a separation of an adult from a child, are much better at identifying all those parties to facilitate reunification down the line. As I mentioned, the Biden administration is trying to find ways to allow non-parental adults who travel with children, maybe it's an aunt or an uncle or a grandparent, to either remain with that child or be reunited with them very quickly. So I think there were some lessons learned to facilitate when, this kind of thing maybe has to happen under current law. But, the tragedy is that thousands of parents and children had to suffer very serious trauma caused by the United States government, the place that they had hoped to come for safety, to learn those lessons.
So, final question. The article closes with repeated warnings that a policy like zero tolerance could happen again if Trump or a candidate like him is elected in 2024. And Dickerson emphasizes that the lack of congressional action has left immigration policy up to the whims of the executive. What do you make of this warning? Do you think zero tolerance or a policy like it could be implemented again? And what does this say about the state of our immigration policy?
Well, as I mentioned, immigration hawks, especially in the Republican Party, are currently trying to, by legislation, reinstitute things like migrant protection protocols, or keeping Title 42 in place, or even restoring the construction of the wall, and maybe even things like prosecutions. There are a lot of people in Washington who really do believe that these policies, if enforced to their full, will stop what they see as chaos at the border. I think that the evidence is against that, but that's what they strongly believe. So certainly it could happen that a future Republican administration or Republican-controlled Congress could try to mandate this again. If it's by executive order, when Trump did it, he was sued. And a lot of the information we have about the child separation policy came out as a result of the lawsuits that were pending. And, if you recall, at the beginning of the Biden administration, President Biden inherited those lawsuits from the Trump administration, and at first had tried to negotiate a settlement with the parents of separated children. That was leaked to the press. There was a lot of news coverage about, giving hundreds of thousands of dollars to illegal immigrants, and so they stopped those negotiations. But those court cases are still out there and pending. So I do think that, it's very likely the courts could intervene in these cases about how it's being conducted. And that may limit a future administration and what they can do, whether they could do it, as extremely as the Trump administration did. I'm not so sure. But obviously, if Congress passes legislation, then, that specifically authorizes this, for example, then it would be up to the courts to say whether that legislation was unconstitutional. Rather than whether an administration was doing something that violated civil rights or other portions of the law. So, and constitutional claims are usually much harder to engage in. So I think, like with everything else in immigration policy right now, probably it's going to be the courts that will be the arbiters of this, at least in the short term, because I don't see Congress really getting its act together to pass a lot of this in the short run. But we'll see. We have to see.
Okay, well, thank you so much for coming on and discussing the news of the day and the news of the summer. And we will see you in 2 weeks.
Absolutely.
And that's it for our show this week. One last reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find more information on all the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. I'm Hannah Tyler. This Week in Immigration was created and executive produced by Theresa Cardinal Brown. This week's episode was written by Hannah Tyler, Theresa Cardinal Brown, and Marisol Hernandez. Ethan Plotkin produces and edits our show. The executive producer of BPC Podcasts is Lucy Manning. See you in 2 weeks.